My name is Claire Donovan, and at 21 years old, I sat in a probate attorney's conference room and watched my grandfather's life get divided up like items at an estate sale, each one claimed with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting a long time and had their lists prepared. I was the youngest person in the room by 15 years. I was also, as it turned out, the only one who had actually known him. The attorney was a man named Hartwell, compact and deliberate, with the kind of face that has practiced neutrality for so long it has become the default setting. He read from the document in the flat, unhurried tone of someone who understands that what he is saying matters enormously to the people in the room and not at all to the words on the page. My grandfather's estate was substantial. I had known it was substantial in the way that you know things about family wealth, when you grow up adjacent to it, in the quality of the furniture and the ease with which certain problems got solved, and the particular confidence that people carry when they have never had to wonder very hard about money. But the specific figures, read aloud in Hartwell's conference room, were larger than I had assembled in my head. The properties alone ran to 7 figures before you reached the investment accounts. My Uncle Daniel sat to my left. He was my grandfather's younger son, a man of 52 who had spent his career in commercial real estate and who wore his success in the particular way of people who need you to register it. His wife, Patricia, was beside him, her attention so focused on Hartwell that she appeared to be trying to absorb the words through concentration alone. My cousins Daniel's children, Marcus and Lee, were at the far end of the table. Marcus was 30 and worked for Daniel's firm and had the same quality of alert stillness that his father had, the stillness of a person in a meeting they have already decided the outcome of. Lee was 27 and had made it clear in various small ways throughout my life that she found me more puzzling than interesting. My father was not there. He had died when I was 11, my grandfather's elder son, and that loss had made me, I think, my grandfather's project in a way that none of the others had been. He had taken me in during summers after my father died, driven me to things, sat with me in his study for long evenings talking about subjects that wandered without apology, history, geology, the mechanics of old instruments, the question of what a person owed to the time they had been given. He was the kind of man who thought carefully about everything and announced his conclusions rarely, and I had spent a significant portion of my childhood learning to pay attention to the gap between those two things. He had died in March, at 81, after a brief illness he had apparently declined to mention to anyone until it was nearly over. I had been at university, 4 hours away, and I had gotten the call on a Tuesday morning and driven up and arrived 2 hours after he was gone. I had sat in his study alone for a long time, looking at his things, trying to understand that the specific frequency of the world he had occupied was now silent. The will reading was 6 weeks later. I had spent those 6 weeks finishing my semester on a kind of autopilot that I was neither proud of nor apologetic about. You do what you can. Hartwell read through the bequests in the order they appeared in the document. The primary residence, a large house on 12 acres outside of Concord, went to Daniel. The investment portfolio, divided into specific tranches, went to Daniel and to a charitable trust my grandfather had established years earlier, with defined percentages that Hartwell walked through without apparent awareness of how Marcus was doing math on his phone under the table. The commercial properties, 3 of them, in Boston and Providence, went to Daniel's firm in a structured arrangement that involved a valuation process I didn't fully follow, but that made Daniel nod with a satisfaction he was almost managing to contain. I watched all of this and thought about my grandfather and what he had wanted, and tried not to decide in advance what the document would say about me. Hartwell turned a page. To my granddaughter, Claire Marie Donovan, he read, "I leave the Halcyon Hill Observatory, located on the property at the top of Halcyon Road, including the structure, the telescope, and all associated equipment and records, to be hers in full and without condition." Silence. Then Marcus, who had looked up from his phone, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was working toward one. Lee's expression was the specific kind of carefully arranged neutrality that people deploy when they want to appear to be suppressing amusement rather than actually suppressing it. Daniel looked at me, and his face did something complicated that I read as genuine sympathy working against the instinct to agree with his children. "The Observatory," Patricia said, in the tone of someone confirming a misheard word. "The Observatory," Hartwell confirmed, without inflection. The Halcyon Hill Observatory was a structure on a piece of land my grandfather had owned for 40 years, at the top of a hill about a mile from the main house. I had been there twice as a child. It was a stone building, round, with a dome that had once opened via a mechanical slit, but which, as far as anyone knew, had been stuck for at least 20 years. Inside was a large telescope on a central platform, an instrument my grandfather had acquired in the 1970s and installed himself, with help from a machinist he had apparently driven 3 states to find. The telescope was enormous and old, and had not, by any account anyone in the family could produce, been used since sometime in the late 1990s. The dome didn't open. The equipment was obsolete. The building needed work. It was, in the consensus of everyone in that room except me, worth somewhere between very little and the cost of demolishing it. Marcus said something to Lee in a voice low enough to be deniable. She smiled at her hands. Daniel said, "Claire, I know it's not," and then stopped, because there was no way to finish that sentence that didn't make the situation more uncomfortable than it already was. "It's fine," I said. "I know what it is." I was not sure, at that moment, that I did. But I knew what they thought it was, and I knew what my grandfather had thought about the gap between those two things, and I thought it was worth finding out which one was right. I signed the transfer documents the following week. The road up to Halcyon Hill was unpaved and steep enough that my car protested the incline in second gear. It was a Tuesday in May, 3 weeks after the will reading, a clear afternoon with the kind of light that makes everything look more considered than it probably is. The hill rose above the surrounding terrain in a way that felt deliberate, as if someone had positioned it specifically to give a clear view in every direction. At the top, surrounded by a stone wall with a gate that opened on a key I had been given by Hartwell, was the observatory. It was smaller than I remembered, and also more present. The stone was old granite, laid in a period when people built things to outlast the reason for building them. The dome above the main structure was weathered copper, gone to the green of old money, and even stuck and sealed as it apparently was, it had a formal dignity about it. I stood at the gate for a moment with my hand on the iron latch. I had been thinking, on the drive up, about what my grandfather had said to me once about the difference between things that were expensive and things that were valuable. I had been maybe 14, and we were looking at something in an antique shop that he was considering, and I had asked him what made it worth the price. He had looked at me, with that particular attention he gave, questions he thought deserved consideration. "Expense is what someone will pay," he said. "Value is what something actually does for the person who has it. They overlap less often than people assume. The observatory had no expense. The question was what it did." Inside, the main room was larger than the exterior suggested, the space dominated by the telescope's central mounting, a massive column of steel rising from the floor to a height of perhaps 10 feet. With the telescope itself angled upward at roughly 45 degrees and pointing at the dome as if waiting for it to open. Around the base of the column was a circular platform, raised a few inches off the main floor, accessed by 3 low steps. The platform was the kind of thing you stood on to use the eyepiece, which at the telescope's current angle was at about head height. The room smelled of metal and stone, and something underneath that I identified eventually as machine oil. Very faint. The ghost of maintenance performed a long time ago. There was a workbench along one wall, with tools on a pegboard and a set of binders in a metal rack, and 2 wooden chairs that had been there long enough to belong, and a cast-iron radiator that was cold and had probably been cold for years. Thin light came through 2 small windows and through the gap around the dome slit, which wasn't as fully sealed as I had been told. I walked around the telescope. It was a Cassegrain reflector, I knew that much, with a primary mirror that my grandfather had told me was 18 inches in diameter, which was large by the standard of what amateurs typically built, but not unusually so, for someone with his resources and his inclinations. The mounting was equatorial, designed to track objects as the Earth rotated, motorized originally, but the motor long since disconnected. There was a hand crank on the right ascension axis, tarnished brass, and another on the declination axis, and both of them moved when I tried them, stiff but not seized. I stood beside the telescope for a while and looked at the dome and thought. Then I went to the workbench and opened the first binder. My grandfather had kept records of everything. I had known this in the abstract. It was one of the things people said about him, that he documented his processes, that he thought records were a form of respect paid to the work, but the binders made it concrete. There were 7 of them, each one covering a span of years, each one filled with his handwriting and with technical diagrams and with the occasional photograph, taped to the page at its edges in the way of someone who understood that adhesive degrades and planned accordingly. The records went back to 1971, when he had acquired the telescope and begun the process of installing it, and ran forward to 2003, the last dated entry. After 2003, nothing. 20 years of silence. I read for 2 hours at the workbench, working through the binders in order. The earlier ones were primarily technical observations recorded in the precise shorthand of someone who knew what they were doing, equipment logs, calculations. The later ones shifted tone slightly, became more reflective. The observations still there but accompanied by more personal annotation. My grandfather writing about what he was seeing and what he was thinking about while he saw it. He wrote about my father in the later binders, after my father's death, in a way he had never spoken to me directly. He wrote about the observatory as a place where the noise of certain things diminished to a level he could manage. I was in the 5th binder, dated 1994 to 1998, when I found the loose page. It had been folded in thirds and tucked inside the back cover of the binder, not part of the bound record but kept with it. I unfolded it carefully. It was a single sheet in my grandfather's handwriting, undated, the ink less faded than the binder entries around it, which suggested it had been placed there later. It said, Auriga, February 14th. Let the machine do what it was built to do. That was all. I read it 3 times. Auriga was a constellation I knew it vaguely, the Charioteer, a pentagon of stars visible in winter and early spring. February 14th was a date. Let the machine do what it was built to do was a sentence that could mean several things, and that I chose, standing in the observatory in the May afternoon light, to take literally. I took out my phone and found the coordinates of the central star of Auriga as it would appear from this latitude and longitude on the 14th of February at, I guessed, midnight, the traditional hour, for this kind of thing, in the tradition my grandfather had worked in. I wrote the numbers in my notebook. Then I looked at the hand cranks on the telescope and the setting circles on the axes, the graduated rings that indicated where the telescope was pointing in the sky, and I understood that I had work to do before February, which was 9 months away. I went back every week, sometimes twice a week. The observatory became the structure around which the rest of my schedule arranged itself, the fixed point that the other things orbited. I finished my degree in the autumn semester remotely, submitting work from a rented room in the town below the hill, spending my evenings at the workbench with the binders and a set of astronomy references I had ordered in, rebuilding my understanding of the telescope from the documentation my grandfather had left. I learned to read the setting circles. I learned the backlash in each axis, the small amount of play in the gears that you had to account for to get an accurate position. I learned the particular stiffness of the right ascension crank at certain positions, which I eventually traced to a slightly bent tooth on one of the intermediate gears, something that had apparently been present for years and compensated for by whoever last used the instrument. The dome remained stuck until October, when I finally identified the mechanism that was supposed to drive the slit and found that the cable had snapped at some point and coiled itself into a jam inside the housing. I replaced the cable over the course of a weekend with the help of a rigger I found through the local trades listings, a taciturn man named Carl who looked at the dome mechanism with professional assessment and said it was not as bad as it looked, which turned out to be true. The slit opened on a cold Sunday afternoon in October, and the rectangle of sky it revealed was the first outside light the telescope had seen in probably 2 decades. I stood on the central platform and looked up through the open dome and felt something that I didn't try to name at the time. That winter I also found the letter. It was not in the binders. It was in a metal document tube, the kind that architects use for rolled drawings, stored vertically in the back corner of the workbench's lower cabinet, behind a box of spare eyepieces and a jar of optical cleaning solution that had dried to a residue. The tube was sealed at both ends with rubber caps that had hardened with age and required a utility knife to remove. Inside, rolled around a cardboard core, was a piece of drafting paper, and, inside that, a sealed envelope. The envelope had my name on it. I set it on the workbench and looked at it for a moment. It was the same cream paper he used for personal correspondence, sealed with the green wax I recognized from letters he had sent me at school. I broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. "Claire," it began, "if you are reading this, then you came. That is the first thing, and it matters more than you might think it does, because I was not certain anyone would. I was certain you might. That distinction was enough to build on. I want to explain what I have done and why, in the order that those things actually happened, because the order matters. When your father died, I spent a long time thinking about what the problem was with the way wealth moves through families. The problem I kept arriving at was not greed, though greed is present. The problem was that money, moved in the ordinary ways, through wills, through structures, through the division of things among people who are present and insistent, always flows toward the people who are already oriented toward it, the people who are watching, the people who understand the language and show up at the right meetings. It does not flow toward the people who are looking at something else. It does not flow toward curiosity or patience or the willingness to stand in the dark on a cold hill and wait for the sky to do something. Your Uncle Daniel is a capable man. His children are capable. They will do competent things with what I have left them, and I wish them well with it, and I do not pretend the estate is a punishment for them. It is what they came for, and I am not interested in cruelty. But there is a category of what I actually built my life around, not the properties and the accounts, which are the scaffolding of a life, and not the life itself, that I was not willing to leave to the ordinary process. I spent too long building it and thinking about it, and I knew too well that the people who would receive it through ordinary channels were not equipped to understand what they had received. I needed it to go somewhere specific. I needed it to go to you. I designed the observatory 20 years ago as a lock. The telescope is the key. Anyone can inherit a building. I needed to be sure that the person who found what is below it had been here, had read the binders, had understood the instrument well enough to follow a single instruction accurately. The note in the 5th binder is the instruction. You have already found it, or you would not be reading this. On the night specified, point the telescope at the position specified with the precision required by the setting circles, and let the declination axis reach its lower mechanical stop. The floor will do the rest. I want to say one more thing before you go downstairs, because I will not have another chance to say it. You were always the one who listened to the gap. Other people listened to what I said. You listened to what I was saying and what I was not saying simultaneously, and you understood the difference. That is a rare quality, and I watched you develop it from the time you were small, and I was never able to say directly how much I valued it, because I am not, in the end, a man who says things like that directly. This is the closest I have managed. The letter will be clearer than I ever was in person. I think that is the right order. All my love. Always, your grandfather. I was at the observatory at 11 o'clock on the night of February 14th, alone on the hill with the dome open and the sky very clear and very cold. I had checked the forecast every day for a week. It had been worth checking. The window was narrow, a clear night between two systems, and by morning a front would come through and close it down for days. The stars in Auriga were high and sharp, the Pentagon distinct, Capella at its brightest at the apex. I had spent the previous 3 days in a state of focus that left little room for anything else. I had worked out the exact coordinates on the setting circles. I had accounted for the bent gear tooth and the right ascension backlash. I had practiced the movement twice in daylight, dry runs with the dome closed, getting the feel of the cranks at the specific positions I would need. There is a quality of attention that comes over you when you understand that something has been built specifically for you to operate, and that the person who built it trusted that you could, and that the trust was the whole point. That quality of attention is very clean. It cuts through everything else. At 11:45 I climbed to the platform and positioned myself at the controls. The cold was substantial, the kind that gets into your hands through gloves and makes fine motor work harder than it should be. I worked the right ascension crank slowly, watching the setting circle, taking up the backlash before committing to the position. The telescope moved with the deliberate steadiness of a well-made thing that has been waiting to be properly operated, and I had the thought that this was what it had been doing for 20 years, waiting to be properly operated, and that the waiting had not damaged it. I reached the right ascension position. I locked the axis and moved to declination. The crank on the declination axis was stiffer, as it always was, and I moved it in increments, checking the circle between each adjustment. The stars through the open dome slit rotated as the instrument moved, the field of view I had been tracking, swinging into the eyepiece, and then out of it, and then back, and then the telescope found its position. I know that sounds like something that happens metaphorically, but it was not metaphorical. The declination axis reached a point in its travel, not the mechanical stop my grandfather had mentioned, but close to it, and the resistance changed. Not dramatically, but the crank moved differently, with a quality that was not binding and not stiffness, but something more like engagement, the feeling of a mechanism finding the thing it was designed to find. I slowed down. I turned the crank by increments so small they barely registered as movement. The eyepiece showed me Capella, the bright star at the apex of Auriga's Pentagon, centered in the field with a precision that should not have been possible given the age of the equipment and the condition of the seeing. And yet it was centered, and I left it there. I heard it before I felt it. A sound from beneath the floor, deep and mechanical and resonant, the sound of something large, engaging with something else, large gears. I thought immediately, a gear train, the kind of mechanism that has mass and takes a moment to settle into its final position. The sound was low, and it came through the stone floor and up through the soles of my boots and through the platform I was standing on, and it lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and then it stopped, and in the silence that followed I heard a secondary sound, smaller and closer, a clean mechanical click from somewhere in the floor beneath the central platform. I stepped down from the platform. The central column of the telescope's mounting went down through the floor into whatever foundation supported it below, and around the base of that column, flush with the surface of the platform, I had always assumed was nothing but solid floor. I crouched and looked at the platform surface under the flashlight I had brought. There was a seam. I had looked at this floor dozens of times, and I had not seen a seam. And now, in the specific angle of the flashlight beam, I could see it clearly, a rectangular outline, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, the gap between it and the surrounding floor no wider than a credit card. In one corner of the rectangle there was a small recessed handle, the kind that lies flat until you need it. I pulled the handle. The hatch lifted on a counterweight. It was heavy, heavier than the mechanism suggested until the counterweight took over. And then it rose the rest of the way and locked in the open position with a solidity that made clear it had been engineered to stay open without assistance. Below it, a steel ladder descended into a space that was not dark. A soft light had come on when the hatch opened, triggered by the movement, and it illuminated a chamber below the observatory floor that was not what I had expected, which was a root cellar, or a storage space, or something improvised and rough. It was a room, a proper room, with a finished ceiling 8 feet below the floor and walls that were insulated and panelled and climate-controlled. I could feel the temperature differential immediately. The air rising from below was warmer and drier than the observatory above. The controlled air of a space maintained at a constant condition for a very long time. I climbed down the ladder. The room was roughly the size of the observatory above it, perhaps slightly smaller, circular at the perimeter to match the building's footprint and fitted with built-in cabinetry around the entire wall. The lighting was low and even, the kind that does not degrade what it illuminates, the kind chosen by someone who understood what they were storing. And the cabinetry held. I moved around the room slowly, the flashlight unnecessary now, but still in my hand the cabinetry held paintings, not reproductions, not prints. Paintings in frames behind glass, and some without glass, and each one accompanied by a card in my grandfather's handwriting that gave the artist, the date, the medium, and a line of provenance. I walked the circumference of the room and counted, and when I finished counting there were 31 paintings. I recognized some names from the cards. A regional impressionist I knew from museum visits. 2 works by a modernist whose name I associated with significant auction prices, and several artists I didn't recognize whose names I wrote in my notebook to look up later. On the last one I looked up before leaving, the search results returned a number that made me sit down on the floor of the climate-controlled chamber beneath my grandfather's observatory and stare at my phone screen for a long time. The paintings were not the whole of it. Against one section of the wall, secured in a purpose-built wooden frame, were cases of gold bullion. Not a few coins or bars, but cases, standardized bars, in a quantity I did not try to count that night. On the shelving beside them were locked display cases containing what appeared to be antique scientific instruments, astrolabes, armillary spheres, pocket chronometers in individual boxes, the kind of objects that occupied the intersection of craftsmanship and history that my grandfather had spent his life collecting quietly, without announcement. There was a case of pocket watches and a case of antique surveying instruments, and one long case that held 6 presentation swords from the Napoleonic period, each one in its original scabbard. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time. My grandfather had spent his life, by the account his family gave of it, building wealth in real estate and investment, the ordinary mechanisms of accumulating resources, the scaffolding he had described in the letter. What his family had not known, what nobody had known, as far as I could tell, was that a separate activity had been running in parallel for decades, a patient, unhurried accumulation of things he actually valued, hidden in the ground beneath a telescope on a hill that everyone agreed was worthless. The telescope was the lock. It was not a metaphor. He had designed a mechanism, the gear train I had heard engaging, the hatch and its counterweight that was triggered specifically by the telescope reaching a precise alignment, a position that required the operator to have read the binders, found the note, worked out the coordinates, compensated for the instrument's known imperfections, and been present on a specific date at a specific time. It could not be triggered accidentally. It could not be triggered by someone who hadn't done the work. It required exactly and precisely the kind of person my grandfather had described in his letter, someone who listened to the gap, who was patient enough, who cared enough to be here. He had designed it 20 years ago. He had then left the observatory to fall into apparent disuse, let the dome stick, let the family consensus solidify around the idea that the telescope was broken and the building was worthless. He had maintained the underground chamber on a climate control system that ran from a dedicated electrical connection I later found had been billed to a holding account under a different name. He had maintained the mechanism. He had sealed the letter in the document tube and left the note in the 5th binder and waited. He had waited 20 years for me to be old enough and for him to be gone and for February the 14th to come. I stayed in the chamber for 2 hours that night, moving slowly through the room, looking at everything. I did not touch the paintings or open the cases. I wrote in my notebook until my hand was too cold to write clearly, and then I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about my grandfather. I thought about the rooms in his house I had not been allowed into as a child and had always assumed were simply private. I thought about the trips he took alone that no one asked about and that he described when asked as business. I thought about the way he had looked at things, ordinary things, things in shops and at auctions and in books, with an attention that I had always sensed was evaluating something beyond what was visible. I had spent years learning to pay attention the way he paid attention, and it had never occurred to me that what he was paying attention to had a physical location. It was here. All of it. Everything he had actually built his life around. I climbed the ladder and closed the hatch and stood in the observatory in the cold night air, with the dome open and Capella bright at the apex of its pentagon, and I thought about what happens next. What happens next, I have come to understand, is the interesting part. Not the discovery, which was one night and is now complete, but the thing after it, the years after it. The question of what a person does when they find themselves in possession of something that was assembled over decades by someone who thought very carefully about what things were for. My grandfather left the paintings and the bullion and the instruments to me, effectively, with the letter as his testament and the mechanism as his delivery system. There are legal processes involved in formalizing that, and I have a lawyer now, a woman in Boston named Okafor who specializes in exactly these situations and who, when I described the underground chamber to her, was quiet for a moment and then said that in 20 years of practice she had never encountered anything quite like it, which she appeared to mean as a compliment to my grandfather rather than a concern about my situation. The instruments are going to a museum, most of them. My grandfather, I think, would understand that the right home for a 17th century astrolabe is not a cabinet in a private residence, and the letter suggested that he cared more about things being valued properly than about their specific location. I am keeping 2 of the pocket watches, one because it is beautiful, and one because it has his initials engraved on the case, and I cannot make myself let it go, which I think is reasonable. The paintings are complicated in the way that anything of significant value is complicated, and I am moving through that complication carefully. 2 of them are going to auction later this year. The others I am not in a hurry about. The bullion is sitting in a bank vault while I think about what I want to do with it, which is to say while I think about what is worth doing, which is a different question and one I am approaching with the patience my grandfather apparently believed I was capable of. The observatory is mine, which is the original fact, and the one that contains all the others. I have had the dome mechanism fully serviced and the electrical system inspected and the stone repointed on the exterior where it needed it. The telescope is operational in a way it has not been in 20 years. I was up there last week on a clear night, alone on the hill, and I pointed it at Jupiter and stood at the eyepiece and watched the cloud bands for an hour, the 4 Galilean moons strung out beside it like punctuation. My Uncle Daniel called me in March, 2 months after the night of February 14th, when some of what had been found was beginning to be known. I do not know exactly how he found out. Lawyers talk to lawyers, records get filed, but he had found out enough to understand that the observatory had not been what any of them had thought it was. He called to say that he felt the estate had perhaps not been distributed in the way my grandfather had intended, which was his way of saying that he wanted a conversation about whether what was in the underground chamber might be shared differently than my grandfather had arranged. I told him that my grandfather had arranged things with considerable precision over a period of approximately 20 years, and that I had a good deal of confidence in the arrangement. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he supposed that was fair. It is fair. That is the right word for it. My grandfather was a fair man who understood that fairness is not the same as equality, and that giving everyone the same thing is only just when everyone has brought the same attention and the same willingness to the work. Daniel and Marcus and Lee received what they came for. They came looking for assets that could be identified and valued and transferred through standard processes, and that is what they received, and there is no dishonesty in any of it. I received what I came for too, which was the thing I had always come to my grandfather for, the thing underneath the surface of things, the actual structure of what he had built, the part that required someone to be curious enough and patient enough and willing to stand on a cold hill in February and turn a hand crank by millimeter increments until the floor opened up. My name is Claire Donovan. I am 21 years old, and my grandfather left me a broken telescope on a worthless hill, and my family laughed at the bequest in a conference room, and they were right about every fact they cited and wrong about every conclusion they drew. The telescope was not broken. The hill was not worthless. The bequest was the opposite of what it appeared to be, and understanding why required exactly the qualities that my grandfather spent my childhood quietly noting, and that my family spent my childhood failing to see the point of. He saw the point. He spent 20 years making sure the point would outlast him. The dome is open tonight. The sky is clear, which is not guaranteed in February or in any other month, and the mountain air is cold enough to make the seeing sharp and the stars steady. I am going up to the hill. I have a thermos of coffee and my notebook and the specific quality of attention that my grandfather taught me, and the telescope is waiting on its mounting with the hand cranks ready and the setting circles at 0. There are other things to look at. He taught me that. There are always other things to look at, if you are willing to move the instrument and wait.